Why use getter and setter methods? Many people are introduced to objects this way, and getter and setter methods seem a little bit pointless. If I have a point class with attributes x and y, I could construct a point in another class this way, and I can just access the attributes directly from this other class. I could print them by saying p.x. I could set them to be a new value, p.x equals 20 instead of 10, and then I can print it out again. And we can run it, and you can verify that this works. As you can see, the p.x here has referred to the x variable that is inside the object p. And if I were to change the x to something else, xval, for example, here, xval, all of a sudden, this would fail to refer because there is no variable x anymore inside the point class. For your own small projects, there's really not a strong reason not to do this. But as soon as you start writing projects that you expect to maintain over more time, that you expect might get bigger, that you might write with other people, I think there are strong reasons why you don't want to let code that uses your object have direct access to that object's variables. So that's what getter and setter methods are for. They're for protecting these variables from being interfered with outside the class. And I'll give you two examples of why you want to do this. Instead of a point class, let's say we're making some type of tower defense game and we need some kind of enemy class, but our enemies are going to be circles. So we'll call it enemy. So let's define an enemy class. So here's a basic one. It will have coordinates where it will appear on the screen, x and y. It will have a radius, and it will have a certain number of hit points, which is how many times it has to get hit by a bullet before it gets destroyed. And we have a basic constructor. And we, of course, would want to give it a lot of other methods. But let's start here. Here, I've created an enemy instance at xy coordinates 10, 10 with a radius of 60 and 4 hit points. As we said before, because all of our attributes are public, we can access them directly from any other class. So I can immediately reset the radius if I change my mind to be, instead of 60, I could reset it to be 30. So one problem is, what if I set it to a value that's not valid? What if I set the radius to negative 30? Right now, there's nothing preventing this from happening except the programmer remembering not to do it. You might be thinking, what kind of programmer would set the radius to be negative 30? But remember that your radius might get set by the output from another method. This might be happening in a much larger code base with a lot of other code. So letting any code have direct access from your variables is a little bit unsafe. Not that anybody's going to do anything maliciously, but bugs happen very easily. And so just letting your attributes get set to any value leaves them unprotected if certain values would be invalid. So one thing you can do to protect from this kind of thing is setting all of your attributes to be private, like this. And you'll see that as soon as I make it private, it says one related problem. And the problem is, now that radius is private, we can't directly set it. Here it says radius has private access in enemy, which means that we're not allowed to set it directly. So let's make a setter method. Now that I have a public method called setRadius, I can do this same thing by running the method. So I could say e.setRadius negative 30. Well, the whole point of this was I wanted to be able to control who sets my values so that the values are always valid. So instead of just taking the new value and setting the radius, now I can have checks. I could say if new value is greater than 0, then do the setting, otherwise don't do anything. And so now this still compiles. I can still run it, but when I run setRadius, negative 30 will get copied here. It will fail this if statement, and so we won't ever set the attribute to a value that would be invalid. So that's one reason to use getters and setters. It lets objects control their own attributes. They control their own values, and that means the object gets to decide for itself if a new value is okay or not. This makes it a lot less likely that bugs will happen, because you don't have to keep all of the constraints that an object has in your mind while you're using it. You can use the object using its methods and feel safe that you're not going to accidentally do something that's not allowed because the object is protecting you so that you can't do something that's not allowed. For small projects, that's probably not necessary because you can fit all of the details about your project in your mind at the same time. But imagine that you have a project that involves 50 different classes and thousands of lines in the code base. Now maybe you can't fit the entire program in your mind at the same time. And so now it's going to be very important that your objects make it very hard to use them inappropriately. Let's think about a second reason why you wouldn't want to let other parts of your program directly access the attributes. So this is silly code. I just have set up just enough for the example. So ellipse isn't really just drawing my enemy. We can imagine this is a much larger code base. But let's pretend. Let's pretend we've created an enemy instance. Same scenarios before, XY coordinates, radius of 60, 4 hit points. And let's say that when it comes time to render it on the screen, we have an ellipse command that's going to draw a circle at that object's XY coordinates, and the size will be the radius. So here's the problem. The problem is now this part of my code depends directly on this name. And so if I change my mind about how I want to implement radius, if I make any change here, that's going to break this code. And again, remember, what if we have thousands of lines of code and lots of different places where we're directly referring to this variable? If I change my mind and I want to make this a double, for example, suddenly this is broken. But if I didn't refer directly to the details of how I've implemented it here, then I would be free to make changes however I wanted without breaking how the rest of my code is using it. So let me do a slightly different example here. Let's say that we don't want the radius to be separate from the hit points. Let's say that we want it to be the case that the radius is always 10 times the number of hit points. So if it's got 4 hit points, it'll have a radius of 40, 3 hit points, it will have a radius of 30. So one thing that we could do would be this. We could keep the radius variable, but we could just change it every single time we get hit. So we could say public void hit, and then we'd say if hit points are greater than 0, then we'll both subtract from the hit points, and also we'll have radius equals radius minus 10. So that would do it. Now every single time we get hit, we're changing both variables. But again, the mere fact that I have this variable means that it's possible that radius could become separate from hit points. So a better way to do this would be something like the following. I'm going to remove the radius variable entirely. Well, hold on, let's do this. Let me do it in 2 parts. So first, let's pretend that instead of public attributes, turns out I can't speak and type at the same time. Instead of public attributes, we have private attributes. And let's say we'd made a getter method. So public int radius, and that's just going to return this dot radius. Okay, so now instead of e.x, I'm no longer allowed to directly refer to x, so instead I use a getter method, getx. And what getx does is it just returns the value of x. So that might seem pointless because I've just introduced a method that lets me access the variable, but I could have done that without making it private by just keeping it public. But here's why that's an advantage. Now, I don't have to change this code at all if I want to change how radius works inside the enemy. I might decide I want to get rid of the radius variable entirely, so I'm not going to have a radius. So let's change the constructor. So now actually I do have to change the constructor over here. And getRadius no longer returns a variable because there isn't a variable. Instead, it will return this.hp times 10. So from the outside of the object, from anybody who's using the enemy object, it looks like there's a radius. But on the inside of the enemy object, the radius is always just hit points times 10. That was a simple example, and you might be thinking, well, we didn't need to do all that for such a simple example. But I'm trying to illustrate the kind of situation that might happen. You might add even more complexity. You might have a Boolean variable called difficult, which is should it be difficult, yes or no. So we'll set difficult to be false in the constructor to start with. And now maybe getRadius depends on whether or not the enemy is a difficult one. So you could say if difficult is true, then we'll return this dot hit points times 5. Otherwise, we'll return this dot hit points times 10. So you can have a more complex rule or a more complex procedure that results in the specific value of the radius that you want. But my point is we're free to change how we're implementing the enemy class. We can make whatever changes we want, and it won't break the code that's using the enemy, because the code that's using the enemy is only accessing the attributes through getter methods. And so that leaves us free to change them however we want, and nothing will break. So that's the second reason. If objects control their own implementation, that's how they work rather than what they do. That means that you can change how an object works internally without breaking other code. And this happens a lot for bigger projects. You might think of a more efficient way to do something, or you might decide that you want to extend it to make it more complicated. And as long as your objects are self-contained, as long as they're modular, as long as they control their own implementation, you're free to do that and you won't break anything.